We are presenting over the connection between Shakespeare's Hamlet and Irving Goffman's book entitled The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And our presentation is entitled All the World's a Stage. Our thesis states that the microsociology examined in Irving Goffman's presentation of everyday life augments the apparent success and forethought that precede the use of manipulation and false identity in William Shakespeare's Hamlet. So first thing is this term microsociology. It explains the study of human interactions on a small scale, usually in face-to-face situations or in conversations or daily life. And this is something that Goffman really pioneered with this book and really examined a lot closer and in a very different way than philosophers and sociologists had before him. He was a temporary president for the American Sociological Association, and he had teaching positions at various universities, including the University of Berkeley, and also published a wide variety of sociological books and periodicals. He wrote various books and periodicals suggesting that people constantly seek to create new identities and present themselves in a way that is different from their apparent nature or the way that they are to themselves. This sort of disconnect between self and how someone else sees self. And he discussed the way in which people are first and foremost performers fabricating identities in their everyday lives. And you'll see this throughout the presentation, the way that he takes the idea of the performer and the audience and translates that into this microsociology field. So,
I will be teaching over the introduction and chapter 1, and so I'm going to be using some of the terms to help to educate you about the microsociology in terms of the introduction in chapter 1. So first off, we are going to be talking about the definitions of performance, routine, and social role, respectively. So those are important general definitions that are used throughout the entire book, because this is all really being set up as one giant metaphor. Each person is a performer in their own right, and so they will have different performances, they will have routines, and they will also have social roles. And so it's important to know what those things mean. Also, I'm going to be talking about the importance of expectation, and so how that will apply to both the audience and to the performer, as well as the importance of expression, and that specifically applies to the performer. So, for the introduction, the definition of performance is going to be activity used by the performer to influence other participants. And so this is a pretty simple definition to catch. If we were going to relate that to Hamlet, it would be about one of the different performances he would have had was his performance when he went and visited Ophelia while she was sewing in her closet, and then he put on the whole crazy act holding her out. And so that would be one example of a performance. And so routine is going to be your pre-established pattern of action that unfolds during a series of performances. And so this is going to be something that's established over a series of different performances. It's going to be something that unites them all together. So an example of that relating back to Hamlet would be one of the times lots of the times when Hamlet is going to establish this routine of acting crazy. He's going to do that over multiple different performances. And so that will be his new routine. Obviously his older routine was not acting mad, quite the opposite. And then social role is going to be an enactment of rights and duties attached to a given status. So Hamlet's social role at the time would have been the fact that he was the prince and the heir to Denmark, which is established early on in the play. And so because of that, different people of the participants, the different audience members, have to give him different rights and also know he himself has duties based on that social role. And so the next thing is the importance of expectations. So expectations are going to guide our actions in a given situation based on information previously acquired. And so it's important for the people to acquire information, the different participants during different performances. The audience members are going to glean that information, and that's going to tie in really closely with expression, because the performer's expression is going to dictate what the different audience members are going to glean, and that's going to define their expectations of the performer. There's two different types of expectations. Expectations that the audience have of a performer, and expectations that the performer has of its audience. So it's a two-way communication and exchange. And so an example of an expectation would be given the information that Hamlet is becoming mad. The audience isn't going to be stifled by his, the way he acts with Ophelia during the little play inside the play. So that's during Act 3, Scene 2. And so the audience is not going to expect as much from him because of that. The importance of expression is going to be that, again, it's the carrier of the information that is conveyed by the performer, whether this is intentional or unintentional. So obviously, two different types of expression, the purposeful expression and the non-purposeful expression. So an example of that would be, an unintentional example would be in Act 1, Scene 2, when Hamlet says the "nay, I know not seems it is," and he's upset about his father's death. That is a natural feeling that he has, and he's going to express it outwardly, but it's not necessarily intentional. Whereas an unintentional expression would be, or an intentional expression of madness would be in 3.1. So now we're moving on to the intentional, and that would be when he has the whole "get thee to a nunnery" rant with Ophelia. That's not really what he believes, which is shown later on when he's like, "I loved Ophelia," but he is going to act that way purposefully to convey something different, and in return it's going to change the audience's expectations. And so the ultimate goal is going to be to gain the response from others that most favorably aligns with one's personal goals. And so at the time, Hamlet's goals had changed. He wanted revenge, and the best way that he sought to go and do that was to change his expression and therefore change the expectations of the audience. So now moving on to Chapter 1, which is performances. The different things I'll be talking about with Chapter 1 is the belief in the part 1 is playing, front, and misrepresentation. And so moving on to the belief in the part 1 is playing, there are two different extremes. One extreme is that one is fully taken in by their performance, and so they're fully convinced by the way that they're acting. And the other extreme is that the performer is not at all taken in by their own routine, and so our decision as the analyzers of the play is to decide where Hamlet lies, and I personally believe that it shifts throughout the play. In Act 3, Scene 2, he says, "Oh, I eat the air like a chameleon." He isn't really taken in by those words. They don't really mean very much. They're just a bunch of things that he's saying to the people to convey that he is mad, but in his own mind, he knows that he's pretending to be mad. Whereas when he becomes upset about Ophelia in Act 5, he's like, "I loved Ophelia, and more than 1,000 or 4,000 of your brothers cannot make up for the love I have for her." The audience still claims that he's mad, but it seems that in this sense he's more taken in by his own actions. And so the question is whether or not this is really a performance that is intentional now, or whether it's unintentional. But in this case, it seems that he is more taken by his performance, so he believes what he is portraying. Fronts are going to be part of the performance that function in a general and fixed fashion to define the situation for the observers, using equipment like the setting, the mannerisms, the appearance of the performer. And so we would expect naturally that the different parts of the front would remain consistent with one another, and that is how we make different assumptions about people, because if we see and notice one part of the front, we can only expect, it's natural for us to assume that the rest of the parts of the front are going to remain consistent. And so that's another way of gaining information. For example, if the idea that Hamlet is mad coupled with the way that he dresses when he goes and visits Ophelia, it makes sense that he would be mad because his dress is completely, he has his stockings ungartered, and I believe the quote is up here. Yes, doubly all embraced, no hat upon his head, his stockings fouled. So that is consistent with the idea that he is mad, and so that would be part of his front at the time. He purposefully came into the closet that way to present that idea to the audience. And so the next idea, which is misrepresentation, is going to be more about how the audience must accept performed cues, because that's the way that they're gaining information. So given the fact that they have to take these different cues on faith, it's likely that the performer is going to misrepresent some of the facts in order to gain the right response, because remember, he wants to obtain the most favorable responses to achieve his personal goals. And so there's a lot of examples of Hamlet misrepresenting himself. But the question is, did he eventually become mad when he began to misrepresent himself as mad? And so then you have to question whether he's truly misrepresenting himself at that point, which goes back to the idea of believing in one's role, because it seems that as the play progresses, he's more taken in by his misrepresentation. So it seems to complicate the situation. And so now I will hand it to Christina.
Okay, so I did chapter 2, which was the chapter about teams. I will be covering the definition of a team, performer versus observer and observer, performer behavior, team protection, and direct control. So a team, as in the book, it was defined as a set of individuals who cooperate in staging a single routine. It is also a cooperative activity of some of the participants that seem too important to be handled merely as a variation of the previous theme. One example of this team idea is with the performer and the observer. You can consider it either as two separate teams where you have the performer as one team and observer as another, or in some cases, like we see in Hamlet, you'll see the performer is the observer. Now, this isn't just the case of the observer as the audience, it can be the observer as in a person who is observing others within the play itself. One example of this is in Hamlet when you have Polonius's breaking of basically talking to the fourth wall out into the audience. He breaks talking from Hamlet to talking to himself, but we're able to see in his mind when he breaks this character, when he's speaking with Hamlet in the hall. He breaks from talking to Hamlet and he talks about what's going on with Hamlet, and then he's like, well, I'll speak to him again. And then he breaks back to talking to Hamlet. Another case we see this is when Hamlet is speaking about his daughter Ophelia, and he's like, oh, he's still harping on my daughter, and then goes and talks to him again. There's this sense of anyways, so there's that one example of it. There's several other examples of this too. You have kind of little insights inside people's heads, which is basically where this performer and observer comes from, where it is an absence of his conscience and requires him to act socially a proper way. You also kind of see this somewhat in a performer's behavior, which is the next example. This example is basically pointing out moral standards and associate these standards with the reference of a group. Part of this is you'll see that so the example I have here is when he comes up to the guy digging in the grave. At this point in time, Hamlet's no longer completely acting crazy or mad. He is being himself with Horatio when he is speaking with him. He is no longer putting on this act, and this is where it derives, because normally it seems that you would act different in front of different people. Like if you were to be with a boss, you would act a little bit more sophisticated and not as your normal self, whatever that may be. So this is where you get this performer behavior of the change of behavior, because he is no longer putting on this act. Then there's the team protection. As the duty of the team, you have the circumstance where it is their job to protect the impression of this reality, and members of the team may be required to postpone taking public stands until the position of the team has been settled. The example of this is after Hamlet kills Polonius while he is spying in on him and his mother in his mother's closet. Claudius gets this sudden realization that people are going to blame him and Gertrude for not dealing with this Hamlet's madness situation earlier. In this sense, they are to be punished for something they should have done earlier as a team, the team being the royals controlling, keeping their reputation up instead of downgrading it, which in this case they have kind of blown that away. And then also with teammates, there's typically, at least, not always, but in this case we see that there is one person who is given control of the situation and anything that happens. And in this we see Hamlet is typically the person in control of what's going on within this. Okay. And the next chapter was chapter 3, which was regions and region behavior. And I'll be covering what a region is, its requirements of decorum, front region versus back region, and then the region behavior. So a region can be defined as any place that is bound to some degree by barriers of perception. They can vary in degree in which they are bounded according to the media of communication in which the barriers of perception occurs. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the requirements of a decorum. Usually the requirements are of kind not related to others in handling the conversation. It deals with moral requirements and presumably refer to rules regarding non-interference and non-molestation of others. And this is this example of this type of region is when Hamlet is having his to be or not to be speech. He is basically debating whether it is moral enough to kill himself or not. And so in this thing, he is in this region of debating what is right or what is wrong. Then it goes to talking about the differences between the front and the back region. Front regions are typically where the performance is given, where everything is seen, everything is seen. And then the back region is typically where everything is hidden. That's where the actors break character. They're not themselves anymore. They're somebody else. They're not who they're portraying in this sense. The front region is typically known as higher class, while the back region is the lower class. The example of this, or an interesting thing of this when we get to the example, is there is this moment where there's a passing through when the character passes onto the front region from the back region and then going back. So an example of this passing from the back region to the front region. The back region is where you're truly yourself, which is when Hamlet is finishing his to be or not to be speech, when he is talking about all of this moral choices, whether he kills himself, all this other stuff. Then he notices Ophelia and he instantly switches into the front region where he starts putting on his act again, since he is no longer alone and that he is open to being seen. And then for region behavior, this is where throughout society there tends to be an informal or backstage language, and this is where behavior comes in. The backstage language is typically where it is more vulgar, blunt, not as nice and proper. It's very not good. For occasions and performances. The examples of this is when Hamlet is with Ophelia before the play. He is talking to her. He says very crudely, like, my lady, should I lie in your lap? And that's a nice thought to lie between a girl's legs. This is more this backstage, lower class behavior language that is presented through Hamlet and these scenes. Tyler?
Alright, so for chapter 4, bypassing all of Goffman's little fancy terms and definitions and stuff, chapter 4 is essentially over the supporting cast of a group or a system. And what I'm mainly going to talk about is how people react or how people behave when they are a supporting cast, rather than the main role of it. Now, any sort of little job within this supporting cast can be described as some sort of dull, boring, easy, tedious task, yet it's very necessary. It has to happen. A clean example of this within Hamlet, it would be the watchtowers. At the beginning of the play, they were the ones who originally eyewitnessed the ghost, and frankly, if it weren't for them, the plot wouldn't occur. Yet they're only seen in little bits and pieces in the first 3 scenes, for the first act. Next thing is that people in the supporting cast, often the audiences care about the main roles, the main actors, and who the play or system features. And so the supporting cast often feels left out because of this. They'll feel like they're less important than the other ones. And there's no really good, clean example of it within the play, but one thing I found was Ophelia. Now, Ophelia was just trying to show concern for Hamlet, but he basically just brought her down in insanity with the behavior, or because of that, because Ophelia is being attacked and being downgraded because of him. Then the final little thing about it is, to compensate, a lot of people who generally feel like they're not really worthwhile within the supporting cast, they like to do stuff to re-empower themselves. So they like to be that super mastermind who takes care or catches everyone's little secrets and stuff, and try to be like the higher power of everything. And Laertes is a decent example of this. Laertes, although being in bits and pieces of the beginning of the play, he wasn't really involved until towards the end of the play, where he all of a sudden tries to jump back in as one of the main roles, the guy who's going to kill and finish off Hamlet because of it. Now, moving on to chapter 5. Simple, this is what performer's true character essentially is. Although performers generally look like what they're doing if they're as sincere, or this is about what their actual theology, what their mentality is on the inside. And what that mentality is that they think the audience are just idiots. Because the audience doesn't exactly know what's going on. And I kind of speak of an experience from this. Back when I was in the front ensemble a year ago, I kind of figured since the audience didn't know what the name of the instrument was I was playing, I could get away with stuff like making simple mistakes or being a little bit lazy here and there. And an example of this is Hamlet. Now, whenever they do this stupid little stuff, often they get away, often they don't. An example where they do get away is when Hamlet's little plan with the play, he's observing Claudius in order to find out his true intent. Trying to find out his true intentions. Since Claudius is left out, he doesn't know what he's doing at all because he thinks he's just a crazy person. And now, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, the performers, because of their little theology that the audience don't know what they're doing and they can get away with stuff, they like to solve problems this way. If, let's say, you forget a piece of equipment or something breaks in the middle of the show, they like to stop performing for 2 seconds, kind of lean over, whisper to another performer and everything, and they often think they can get away with it. Not entirely the case, because I speak from example once again, when I left the front ensemble and viewed them as an audience member, I see them do it a couple of times, and it was obvious and looked unprofessional. An example, in the context of Hamlet, Claudius orders a letter to be so that Hamlet is sent to his execution when he's in England, assuming that Hamlet, this audience member, who he thinks is a crazy person he can easily outsmart, won't notice. Hamlet does notice as he replaces it for instead the death of the people who carried the letter. That's basically it for me. Now moving on to Holly.
So I have chapter 6, which was entitled The Arts of Impression Management. And it came across with these 4 main points. First, the principal types of performance disruptions. Those moments when a character's performance, the thing that they want to portray, is interrupted, whether by an audience member or by a mistake. Secondly, the defensive attributes and practices that both the audience and performer can take on to prevent these disruptions from happening. Third, protective practices. That's the actions that the audience or that the performer does to keep this from happening. And then tact regarding tact. An audience member has to behave in a certain way so that they don't disrupt the performer's view, and this is seen more in literal plays than the extended metaphor of a play that Goffman utilizes in this text. But the performer has to use tact regarding this tact. The performer needs to prevent the audience from being able to disrupt their performance. So first is the performance disruptions. The first is inopportune interruptions. People entering the backstage of the area, seeing the performer in a jeopardized position in a place that they do not want to be seen, and saying what they don't want to be seen. And so the example in this in Hamlet is when Polonius sees Hamlet in a place that he shouldn't, in private with his mother, discussing very difficult topics such as Claudius killing his father. And so the line on thou wretched, rash, intruding fool in Act 3, Scene 4. Next is the concept of scenes, which is people creating these disruptions on purpose to stir things up a little bit. Often it's the supporting cast that Tyler discussed. And in this, Hamlet creates scenes. And the interesting thing in Hamlet is that it's not one constant performer and one constant audience. This is shifting back and forth, as Tyler alluded to a bit, with Hamlet disrupting Claudius's performance. Both Claudius and Hamlet have these very strong personalities that they are trying to portray throughout the text. Hamlet trying to act as though he's this crazy person to get what he wants, and Claudius acting guiltless and shameless to get what he wants, or to keep what he already has. And so Hamlet creates these scenes in regards to Claudius when Claudius is attempting to seem quiet and not guilty, such as saying, I prithee, observe my uncle, to Horatio before the play. He wants to catch Claudius in this position. He wants to disrupt Claudius's performance. And all of these interruptions, all of these performance interruptions are called incidents and jeopardize the performer's reality. Next is defensive attributes and practices. And one of the first defensive attributes and practices that a performer has to take on to make sure that their performance continues without disruption is asking that their teammates don't betray the team's secrets. We see this right off the bat in the play in Act 1, Scene 5, when Hamlet asks Horatio and Marcellus to keep the secret of the ghost, saying, swear by the sword, swear, and let us go in together and seal your fingers on your lips. The second defense practice that needs to be obtained in order to have a successful performance is that the performer cannot be carried away by their own show. And the quotes that are in red on my slide are the quotes where Hamlet breaks the necessary practices to keep a performance continuing, such as creating a scene and being carried away by his own show. Especially in the situation with Ophelia. At first he's mad in a way that he is casting her away to continue his performance, and then at the end we see him throw himself into her grave. And so obviously there's a switch there. He is carried away by his own portrayal of madness at some point. Next is protective practices. The audience tact when entering back regions or disrupting performance. As Claudius and Polonius watch over Hamlet, they attempt to be discreet about it. They don't want Hamlet to know that they are observing him in these jeopardized positions while he's having these soliloquies that aren't meant to be seen. Such as in Act 3, Scene 2, Claudius says, madness and great ones must not unwatched go, but he does it discreetly. Then we see Hamlet. We see him say, if his inoculated guilt does not itself unkernel, while again referring to watching the play, he wants to catch Claudius in this back region of the performance when he isn't portraying what he wants to be seen as. Hamlet doesn't hold any tact when attempting to derail Claudius's performance of this guiltless experience. And then finally, tact regarding tact. Performers must act in a way that lets the audience have tact and understand these delicate situations. The way that this explained this in the book, in Goffman's book, was that if you're sitting in a restaurant back to back with another booth, you don't yell out all of your private information because that doesn't let the booth behind you have any tact in regards to eavesdropping on your conversation. Meanwhile, Hamlet didn't really do this. His purpose was to derail the tact of the audience. He wanted to get them involved, wanted to get them uncomfortable with the performance so that he could get a better feel for what's going on. That was his entire point in displaying this madness, as we see in Act 1, Scene 5, when he says that he is going to put on an antic disposition. So our conclusion states that throughout Hamlet, Shakespeare sets up a dynamic between performer and audience in which the struggle for reality is constantly shifting and being compromised, and this can be analyzed as we did through the lens that Goffman provides. And here are our works cited. We will not be accepting questions or comments.
Cool.
Also, thank you.
Also, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Some questions.
The first thing I have to ask is this seeming discrepancy. Kayla, when you were presenting, you had this great bit about how there was a sort of authenticity judged by the genuine action, by how much people get involved in what they're doing. And there's multiple times Hamlet can be seen more and less involved. But in the end, Holly came in and said that it was a genuinely negative thing to be overly involved in this, to be overly invested in the action.
We see this idea in the play itself, when Hamlet says to the performers, don't be too carried away, and also don't be putting not enough into it. You have to be genuine enough so that they understand your performance and so that your performance is perceived as genuine. But if you are too carried into your character, you become Hamlet. You become genuinely mad.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there needs to be some kind of healthy balance between the two extremes, but I just presented the two extremes as they were and showed some examples when Hamlet would fall either to one side or the other. But you can see that in the end he also is going to die, and so I believe that some of his actions due to his constant shifting between extremes is going to play into that.
What was the Joffin? Not having read the book, is there an established sort of, okay, well, this is what you should do, this is the recommended, this way is better than this way, or is it simply a very long, extended metaphor for how we act? Is there a recommended path?
It's a very extended metaphor. I don't know if you had...
I think that the entire book is a recommended path. It's almost a guide of how to behave in these performance situations. As a performer trying to portray this identity to your audience, you want to follow these steps, the steps that we laid out, having the defensive techniques and things like that, so that you have a successful performance.
Also, I read through it a lot that it said specifically multiple times that it's whatever the audience expects. If you don't meet that expectation, it kind of just falls apart. So
Right, yeah.
it was
That's
very,
interesting.
very important to.
So elaborating on that, when Tyler gave me the situation that sometimes on stage he would try to get away with things, for example, would that be an example of not meeting your audience's expectations for the sake of the performance, or would it be a simple common mistake that the actor makes in his portrayal of sincerity?
Like, is it expected? Or?
Yes. Is that an expectation? Is the audience expecting to be fooled?
Well, one thing that was in Chapter 6 in regards to tact and protective practices that the audience must use when observing a performance is that the little mistakes you can't draw on. You, as an audience member, if you see a break in the performance, there's a certain level of tact that you have to have in not exemplifying that, not calling them out on it, no gotcha questions, that sort of thing.
It was also one of the things that I read in my chapter with teams is obviously sometimes they do notice a mistake and your first instinction is to point them out and punish them and get mad at them, but you can't do that. You have to wait till you get to that backstage
It's almost like
area.
a checks and balances system, so if somebody makes a mistake,
You go along with
it's
it.
like it's a natural instinct to patch it up, but if it's, what I read is if it's extreme and lots of people catch it, it can disrupt and kind of ruin the chain, so yeah.
It seems like Hamlet implies that there is an appropriate way to act. Who do you think really decides this appropriate way to act, the audience or the performer?
Based on my chapters, it was the majority, so it would be the audience members, but we each sort of define it as we go. I know my book said a lot of the time if there wasn't already a front for some kind of behavior, you had the option of choosing from already existing fronts. So you're not really allowed to make your own new front. That's seen as unacceptable, so I would assume that it's more of the majority collectively, the audience.
Well, but in the text, we saw Hamlet do that. We saw him create this antic disposition, this crazy madness state that allowed him to delve further into the situation and really see what everyone was up to. And so I think that, in a sense, it depends on who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. Because if we're looking at it from an audience's perspective, you don't want Claudius to have on the front. You want him to be as genuine as possible and portray himself in a genuine way, but Hamlet has to do that. And so Hamlet makes the decision as a performer. So it's this strange sort of balance that I don't know.